Louisiana and New Orleans, and claims all that for their king. The Dutch have established a trading empire. They had some outlets in what is now Delaware, but mostly they were centered where? New York, the Hudson River Valley, all the way up to Albany. And so the Dutch were involved in fur trading with the Native Americans, and they generally had better relations. There were some stresses like the Beaver Wars, but basically the Dutch generally had better relations, as well as the French, because they were involved in trade relations. Also, they didn't have large migrations of large amounts of families like you had in England. And so because of stresses back in England with overpopulation, you started to have a lot of people coming over as indentured servants. And so the English population starts swelling. Now, underneath the monarchies of Charles II and James II, these become known as the Restoration colonies. So they have a new wave of colonization. Sometimes these were called proprietorship colonies because they were given to an individual or a group of individuals in exchange for money that was owed by the crown. So for example, the Carolinas were established. Pennsylvania was established as a proprietorship colony. William Penn set this up for the Quakers. Ultimately, those colonies start to prosper as well. In 1664, James II is awarded New York, and this is basically taken from the Dutch. It had been New Amsterdam and New Netherlands, and this was taken over by James II. And what else is going on there? New Jersey is also formed as a proprietary colony as well. So some stresses, however, in colonial relations, both internally among the colonists and with Native Americans.
Did Georgia count?
Georgia's a little bit later. It is a proprietary colony. It's in the 1730s, though. So it's the last of the colonies. It was set up, yes, as Oglethorpe was given it as a proprietary colony. But then it quickly became a royal colony. So there's a lot of stresses within colonial life. You have Bacon's Rebellion, 1676. This was a rebellion essentially of the underclass, indentured servants, some slaves, led by Roger Bacon.
If you're in the bill, please come to the main office. Shinji, come to the main office.
Rising up against basically the aristocratic class that ran the House of Burgesses. So Lord Berkeley and his friends. And so it kind of showed some of the stresses in society. After Bacon's Rebellion, the Chesapeake colonies, Virginia, Maryland, they start turning less from indentured servitude over to slavery as a labor source. It's more reliable than indentured servants. They don't have to give land out. The indentured servants were stealing land from Native Americans, leading to fighting and problems.
When for a DBQ, like saying like what's like the different like issues that were going on at the time, what would you say are the strongest like Indian ones to use?
Of like clashes.
Yeah.
Like with the Puritans, I would say Metacom's War.
Okay.
Or what's called King Philip's.
Okay.
Or you could use the Pequot War as well. I would say with conflicts and clashes with Native Americans in Chesapeake society, Powhatan, Anglo-Powhatan Wars. There was 3 of those. Internally, you had Bacon's Rebellion. Internally, with the Puritans, you had the Salem witch trials in the 1690s, and this was this hysteria spreads around. Scholars have different interpretations about it, but it definitely shows that there were conflicts within society. That this idea of the city on the hill was kind of disintegrating, and this cohesiveness of this colony was falling apart. Okay, so James II is overthrown back in England by William and Mary in what's known as the Glorious Revolution, and this has an impact on the colonies. James II had tried to unify New England and New York and New Jersey into a massive royal colony called the Dominion of New England under the governorship of a guy named Andros. That only existed for a couple of years, but really what James II was trying to do was clamp down on these colonies because the colonies were pretty much getting used to ruling themselves. They had their own elected establishment, legislatures now, they're making their own rules, they're ignoring these new navigation acts that the British Crown is trying to enforce. And the navigation acts were ways for Great Britain to make money off of the colonies. By controlling the trade, they would make sure that the colonists weren't trading with the Dutch or the French or the Spanish, and only with Great Britain. So through this process, or this economic system known as mercantilism. But basically, after the Glorious Revolution and the ascent of William and Mary, and then you have like Queen Anne, and then you have King George, there's a long period of time where Great Britain and France are starting to come in conflict with each other. And there's a series of small wars. And so British attention was kind of turned elsewhere. So this is sometimes called the era of salutary neglect. Basically, you have this time period again where the colonies were making their own decisions on things. And they were flouting smuggling laws and basically ignoring the power of the British Crown. Also, starting around 1700, you start to have large amount of migration from Ireland, Germany, Scotland, Wales, to all different colonies. By the 1720s, there's a very strict hierarchy in the South of the planter aristocracy, and the planters held massive areas of land. They were growing things like tobacco or rice in South Carolina. They depended upon slave labor, so they had large amounts of slaves. They would enact strict codes to basically keep slaves from rebelling. There were a number of rebellions in the I guess it was, what was it, 1739, the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina. This was the first large slave rebellion. You also have a number of these conflicts between the colonies, between the English colonies, the Spanish colonies, and the French colonies. And these were known as King William's War, Queen Anne's War, the War of Jenkins' Ear, King George's War. They all had these corresponding conflicts back in England. And essentially, these were wars for empire, where England was pushing up against France and against Spain, and each side utilized Native Americans as allies against each other. So these were big precursors for the larger war starting in 1753, which was what? French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War. Okay, so 1754, the French and Indian War has broken out. This was a unifying event for the colonies because they were being called upon to fight for the British Empire against the French. And the colonies themselves even tried to further unify for local defense. And so a number of colonies sent representatives to Albany, New York, and they created the Albany Plan of Union. And this was partly the brainchild of Ben Franklin, but it basically was they wanted to make an alliance with the Iroquois against the French, but they also wanted to have come up with this idea of a mutual body, kind of a ruling body for the colonies that would protect all of the colonies together. And they would all contribute funds, and they would contribute militia. If any colony was attacked, the other ones could come to the rescue. The Albany Plan failed, though. It didn't. They never failed. They never formed this. But it was the first time that they start discussing these ideas of a cohesive unification of the colonies. Another unifying event for the colonies, starting from the 1730s and lasting to the 1760s, was the First Great Awakening. This was a revival of Protestant religion. Religious attention and worship had kind of died down since those early days of the Puritan settlements, and this was a movement of new Protestant thought, like Methodists, Presbyterians, and Baptists, that start spreading their message across the colonies, and it leads to a revival, but it was also in some ways anti-authoritarian because it was a reaction against the established old light churches of the Congregationalists, known as the Puritans, the Quakers, and the Anglican faith. And so these new faiths started attracting a lot of attention. All right, so coming out of this French and Indian War, Great Britain benefits a lot. They gain pretty much everything east of the Mississippi from France. France is the big loser here. They basically gain like maybe a small Caribbean island, I think. They lose everything south of the St. Lawrence. So basically, they still retain. No, they lost that as well. That becomes British Canada. And in fact, a lot of the French-speaking peoples were relocated throughout the British Empire. Many of them settled in the Louisiana area and became known as the Cajuns. And so 1763 rather, the Treaty of Paris. This was important. It basically opened up a large amount of possible land to development. And this is what the colonists wanted. This was why you had people like George Washington getting involved with early clashes with the French in the Ohio River